My sister looked right at me across our mother's dinner table and said, in front of everyone, that I had never really worked a day in my adult life. She said it kindly enough, the way people say hurtful things when they truly believe they are simply stating a fact. "You've been so lucky, Odalise," she said. "You got to stay home with the kids all these years. I don't know how you did it, honestly. I could never just not work." I remember holding my fork very still, looking down at my plate, feeling my face grow warm. What my sister did not know, what almost nobody at that table knew, was that for the past 10 years, I had been quietly running our late father's company from the small office in my own home, every single day, often while a baby napped upstairs or a toddler watched cartoons in the next room. My name is Odalise Whitfield. I am 44 years old. I have 3 children. And this is the story of the year my family finally understood exactly what I had been doing. All those years they thought I was simply staying home. I want to start at the very beginning, because I think it will help explain everything that came after. My father, Thaddeus Whitfield, built a small manufacturing company from almost nothing, starting when I was just a little girl. He made specialized metal parts, the kind used in industrial machines, nothing glamorous, nothing that ever made the news. But he built it carefully over almost 40 years into a solid, respected business with about 60 employees, the kind of company that quietly kept a whole small town's worth of families fed and housed. I have one older sister, Marisette, who is 3 years older than me. Growing up, Marisette and I were close, but we were always very different. Marisette was sharp and ambitious from a young age, the kind of girl who made a 5-year plan when she was still in middle school. I was quieter, more careful, more interested in understanding how things worked underneath the surface than in racing ahead to the next big goal. My father used to say, half joking, that Marisette would run the world someday, and that I would probably be the one keeping the world's record straight while she did it. I did not mind this comparison, honestly. I actually loved numbers and systems and the quiet satisfaction of understanding exactly how a business worked, piece by piece. I studied business and accounting in college, and after graduating, I went to work at my father's company, in the finance office, learning the business from the ground up the way he wanted both his daughters to learn it, even though only I actually chose that path. Marisette, meanwhile, went a different direction entirely, studying law, and eventually building a career as a corporate attorney in the city, a career that came with a large salary, a nice office, and a great deal of visible, easy-to-explain success. I worked at my father's company for 6 years before I married my husband, Roswell Bramwell, a steady, kind man who taught high school science. We had our first child, a daughter named Cordelia, when I was 30. I remember, at the time, everyone assumed I would simply stop working once the baby came, the way many women in our small town did. I remember my father, though, pulling me aside about a month before Cordelia was born and asking me a question that would end up shaping the next 15 years of my life. "Odalise," he said, "I don't want you to disappear from this company just because you're becoming a mother. You understand this business better than almost anyone who works here, including some of the managers who've been here for 20 years. I want to figure out a way for you to keep doing that work, even while you're raising your children." I told him I did not see how that was possible, given how demanding both things were. My father, who was a practical man in almost everything he did, had already been thinking this through. He proposed a plan. I would step back from the office itself, but I would continue managing several of the company's most important financial and planning functions from home, communicating regularly by phone and, later, by computer, coming into the actual office only when truly necessary for important meetings or reviews. My hours would be flexible, built entirely around the rhythms of caring for a baby, rather than a baby being built around the rhythms of a strict 9-to-5 schedule. I agreed, cautiously at first, unsure whether it would really work. It turned out, over the following years, to work better than either of us expected, though I want to be honest that the first year was genuinely difficult, in ways I did not always share with my family at the time. I remember one particular week when Cordelia was about 4 months old, when the company was in the middle of an important annual budget review, and Cordelia came down with a bad cold that kept her up crying most of the night, several nights in a row. I remember sitting at my desk at 2 in the morning, rocking her with one arm while trying to finish a spreadsheet with the other, my eyes burning from lack of sleep, wondering, honestly, whether I had made a terrible mistake trying to hold both parts of my life together at once. I called my father the next morning, exhausted and a little tearful, and told him I was not sure I could keep doing this. He listened patiently, the way he always did, and then he told me something I have carried with me ever since. Odalise, he said, nobody said this would be easy. But easy was never really the goal. The goal was building something real, something that could actually hold both parts of your life at the same time, without forcing you to give up either one. Some weeks will be harder than others. That doesn't mean the whole plan is wrong. It just means you're human. I took a few days to adjust the budget review timeline, something that would have felt impossible to ask for at a traditional office job, but that felt entirely reasonable within the flexible arrangement my father and I had built together. The review got finished a few days later than originally planned, and the company survived just fine. I learned, through that hard week, something important about the whole shape of what I was building, that it did not need to look exactly like a traditional career in order to be a real and valuable one. I want to explain, honestly, what this actually looked like day to day, because I think it matters for understanding why nobody in my family, especially Marisette, ever fully grasped what I was doing. My work was almost entirely invisible to anyone watching from the outside. I did not go to an office building every morning in a suit. I did not have a title that appeared on a business card people saw at parties. Instead, I sat at a small desk in a spare room of our house, often with a baby monitor beside my computer, reviewing financial reports, managing budgets, working through supplier contracts, coordinating with department managers by phone, all while also being available to nurse a baby, comfort a crying toddler, or supervise homework once my children got older. My father trusted me with more and more responsibility over the years. By the time Cordelia was 5 years old, I was handling the company's entire financial planning, working closely with our accountant to manage cash flow, plan for equipment purchases, and prepare the detailed reports my father needed to make major decisions about the business. When our second child, a son named Bertram, was born 4 years after Cordelia, I simply adjusted my schedule again, working during nap times, early mornings before anyone else woke up, and quiet stretches in the evening after the children were in bed. I never once made a big announcement about any of this to my extended family. Partly because it did not feel especially remarkable to me at the time, it was simply how I organized my days, quietly juggling motherhood and meaningful work at the same time. And partly, if I am honest, because I noticed early on that whenever the subject came up even briefly at family gatherings, people's eyes tended to glaze over quickly. Financial planning and supplier contracts are not exactly exciting dinner conversation, especially compared to Marisette's stories about big court cases and important clients. So over time, I simply stopped bringing it up much at all. When people asked what I did, I would usually say something simple, like I stay home with the kids, which was true, as far as it went, even though it left out an enormous part of my actual daily life. Our third child, a daughter named Perpetua, came 6 years after Bertram, something of a surprise, but a very welcome one. By the time Perpetua was born, I had been managing significant parts of my father's company from home for well over a decade, quietly becoming, in practice, if not in official title, one of the most important people in that entire business. My father passed away 8 years ago from a heart problem that had been slowly worsening for years, though he had kept working almost until the very end. His passing was a deep loss for our whole family, and it was also, in a very real sense, a turning point for the company itself. My father had left clear instructions, in his will and in separate conversations he had with our family's longtime attorney, a careful man named Cornelius Ashby, about how he wanted the company handled after he was gone. He left majority ownership of the company jointly to Marisette and me, in equal shares, but he made a specific, deliberate decision about day-to-day management. He named me, not Marisette, as the person who should continue overseeing the company's financial operations and overall direction. working alongside a general manager named Percival Nakamura, who had been with the company for many years and who trusted and respected my judgment completely. I remember sitting in Cornelius's office, hearing this explained after the funeral, and feeling a strange mixture of pride and worry all at once. Pride, because it confirmed something I had quietly known about myself for years, that I truly did understand this business, deeply and completely. Worry, because I understood, even then, that this decision might not sit easily with Marisette, who had always assumed, without ever quite saying so directly, that her law degree and her career success made her the more obviously capable sibling when it came to important family matters. I want to be fair to Marisette here, because I do not think she reacted badly out of simple jealousy or spite. I think she was genuinely confused and a little hurt by our father's decision. She had built a visible, impressive career, the kind of career that came with public recognition and clear markers of success, while I had spent the same years quietly, invisibly, working from a small desk at home. I think, in her mind, it simply did not add up that our father would trust the family company's daily operations to me rather than to her. I remember, actually, a conversation I had with Marisette not long after law school, when she was just starting her career, young and eager and a little nervous about proving herself in a competitive field. She told me, over coffee one afternoon, that she was determined to build a career nobody could ever question or overlook, the kind where her value would be obvious to anyone looking, measured in salary, in title, in the size of the cases she won. I remember thinking, at the time, that this seemed like a reasonable, even admirable goal. I did not fully understand, until many years later, that this same determination to be undeniably visible might have also made it harder for her to recognize a different, quieter kind of value in someone else, someone who had chosen a very different path. She did not fight our father's decision legally, to her credit. She respected our father's wishes, at least on paper. But over the following years, something shifted in how she talked about my role in the family and in the company, whenever the subject came up. At family gatherings, she would sometimes make small, offhand comments, the kind that were easy to dismiss individually, but that added up, over time, into a clear pattern. She would ask me, in front of other relatives, whether I was still just doing the little bit of paperwork for the company, a description that badly understated the actual scope of what I did. She would talk, at length, about her own demanding career, the long hours, the difficult clients, the real sacrifices required to build the kind of success she had built, and then look over at me with a small, sympathetic smile and say something like, "It must be nice, having such a relaxed pace of life." I did not correct her most of the time, for reasons that are a little complicated to explain. Part of it was simple exhaustion. Correcting these comments, again and again, felt like more emotional effort than I had energy for, especially during years when I was also managing 3 children's schedules along with the company's finances. Part of it, too, was a kind of quiet pride I took in doing meaningful work without needing loud recognition for it, the way my father had always quietly done his best work without much fanfare either. And part of it, if I am honest, was a fear that if I did correct her, it might come across as competitive, as though I were trying to prove I had done more than her, which was never actually what I wanted. I simply wanted, somewhere deep down, for her to understand the truth without me having to fight for it. This pattern continued for years, slowly hardening into something that felt, by the time of the story, less like an occasional careless comment and more like a settled family belief. Odalise stayed home. Marisette worked. That was simply how our family had come to understand the two of us, despite how far that understanding actually was from the truth. I remember one particular moment, about 2 years before the dinner I am about to describe, that showed me clearly just how deep this misunderstanding had grown. The company had gone through a genuinely difficult stretch when one of our largest customers unexpectedly canceled a major contract, threatening real financial trouble for the business and, by extension, for the 60 families who depended on it for their livelihood. I spent nearly 6 weeks working almost around the clock, late into the night after the children were asleep, restructuring our budget, negotiating with suppliers for better terms, working closely with Percival to find new customers to replace the lost revenue. It was, without question, one of the most demanding stretches of work I had ever done, more intense in some ways than anything Marisette had described from her own career. At a family dinner during that same stretch, exhausted and running on very little sleep, I mentioned, briefly, that things had been stressful at the company. Marisette had looked at me, a little puzzled, and said, "I didn't realize you still helped out that much with Dad's old business. That's sweet of you, keeping busy with it." I remember going quiet after that comment, too tired that particular evening to correct her, and the moment simply passed, folded quietly into all the other moments like it that had come before. The dinner where everything finally came into the light happened this past spring, at our mother's house, during a gathering to celebrate Perpetua's graduation from middle school, a small but meaningful milestone in our family. The conversation, as it often did, eventually turned to work and careers. Marisette had recently won a large, difficult case for one of her firm's biggest clients, and she was, understandably, proud of it, talking at some length about the long hours, the pressure, the sacrifice it had taken to get there. Then, turning to me with what I genuinely believe she thought was warmth and generosity, she said the words that finally broke something loose in me. "I really do admire you, Odalise," she said. "You've never really worked a day in your adult life, not the way I have, and you've still managed to raise 3 wonderful kids. I don't know how you did it without ever having to juggle an actual career on top of everything. You've been so lucky." The table went quiet for a moment. I remember my mother glancing at me, a careful, slightly worried expression crossing her face, as though she sensed, even before I said anything, that something important was about to shift. I set my fork down carefully, and I took a slow breath before I spoke. "Marisette," I said, keeping my voice calm and even, "I need to correct something you just said, because I think you genuinely do not understand what my life has actually looked like these past 15 years. She looked at me, a little surprised, clearly not expecting pushback. "I have worked every single day, since before Cordelia was even born," I continued. "I have been managing Dad's company's finances from home for 15 years. Not paperwork, Marisette. Real, serious financial planning and management. When Dad passed, he specifically chose me, not you, to oversee the company's daily operations because he trusted my judgment completely, built over more than a decade of watching me handle that responsibility. I have done this work while nursing babies, while helping with homework, while managing a household, because I found a way to build a career that could exist alongside raising our children, rather than instead of it. That is not the same as never working. It is simply a different shape of work than yours, one that happened to be far less visible to the people around me." The table was very quiet. Marisette's face had gone pale, then a little pink, as she absorbed what I was saying. "I didn't know," she finally said, her voice smaller than I had heard it in years. "Odalise, I genuinely had no idea it was that significant. I thought you were just handling a few small tasks here and there, helping out where you could, not actually running things." "I know you thought that," I told her, gently but honestly. "Because I never corrected you all these years when you said things like that. I think some part of me wanted you to understand it on your own, without me having to insist on it. But that was not fair to either of us, honestly. It let a wrong story about my life sit there, unchallenged, for far too long." My mother, sitting at the head of the table, spoke up quietly at that point. "I think," she said, "it might help if Odalise actually showed you what she does, Marisette. Not to prove anything, but simply so you finally understand." I looked at my mother in that moment, a little surprised myself, because I had not realized how much she understood about what had been happening between Marisette and me over the years. Later, after the other guests had gone home, she pulled me aside in the kitchen and told me something I had not expected to hear. "I noticed it too, you know," she said, drying a dish slowly. "The little comments. The way Marisette talked about your life like it was simple, when I knew, from watching you all these years, that it was anything but simple. I should have said something sooner myself. I think, in some way, I got used to it too, the same story everyone else believed, even though I knew better. I'm sorry for that, Odalise. You deserved better from all of us, not just from your sister." I told her I appreciated her saying that, and that it was never too late for a family to look more honestly at itself. I agreed to Marisette's visit to my office, and about a week later, Marisette came to my house on a weekday morning, curious and, I think, a little nervous about what she was about to see. I want to describe that morning carefully, because I think it mattered enormously for what happened next in our relationship. Marisette arrived just after 8 in the morning, right as I was finishing breakfast dishes and getting Perpetua ready for school. She watched, a little quietly, as I managed the ordinary chaos of a school morning, checking backpacks, signing a permission slip, reminding Bertram, now a teenager, about a project due that afternoon. Once the house was quiet, I led her into my small home office, the same spare room where I had worked for 15 years. I showed her the company's financial software I use daily, walking her through the current budget planning I was working on for the upcoming quarter. I showed her supplier contracts I had negotiated the previous month, saving the company a meaningful amount of money through careful, patient renegotiation. I showed her the detailed reports I prepared monthly for Percival Nakamura and the rest of the management team, reports that shaped real decisions about hiring, equipment purchases, and the company's overall direction. I could see, as the morning went on, a genuine shift happening in Marisette's expression, moving slowly from polite curiosity to something that looked, unmistakably, like real surprise. "This is," she said, trailing off, looking at a spreadsheet I had open on my screen, one tracking cash flow projections for the next full year. "Odalise, this is genuinely sophisticated work. I had no idea the scope of what you were actually doing." "I know," I told her, without any bitterness in my voice, simply stating the fact plainly. That was rather the point of me finally saying something at dinner. I did not want you to keep believing something about my life that simply was not true. She sat back in her chair for a moment, looking around my small office, taking in the shelves of neatly organized files, the second monitor I had bought myself 2 years earlier when the work grew complicated enough to need it, the small framed photo of our father on the desk, watching over the work the way he had watched over the company itself for so many years. "Can I ask you something honestly?" she said, "without you thinking I'm trying to compare myself to you?" I told her, of course. "Do you ever resent me?" she asked. "For building the kind of career that got noticed, while yours stayed hidden?" I keep thinking about all those years I made those little comments, thinking I was being kind, and you just sat there, letting me believe something wrong. That must have taken something out of you over time. I thought carefully before answering, because I wanted to be honest rather than simply comforting. "There were years I resented it, yes," I told her. Quietly, in the background, the way you resent something you have decided is simply not worth fighting about out loud. I think I told myself, for a long time, that fighting for recognition would somehow cheapen the work itself, that real value should not need an audience to prove it exists. I still believe part of that. But I also think I let that belief protect me from having a harder, more honest conversation with you, years earlier than I finally had it. I let a comfortable kind of silence stand in for real communication, and that was not fair to either of us in the end. Marisette nodded slowly, absorbing this. We sat together for a while after that, at my small desk, and Marisette asked me question after question, genuinely curious now, about how I had built this arrangement with our father all those years ago. How I managed the daily balance between motherhood and this work, what it had actually felt like, all these years, to do something so significant while so few people around me understood or noticed it. I answered her honestly. I told her there had been real satisfaction in the work itself, in solving genuine problems, in helping build something our father had spent his whole life creating. But I also told her, honestly, that there had been a real loneliness in it too, a quiet ache in being consistently underestimated by the very people who should have known me best, including, at times, her. "I think," Marisette said slowly, near the end of that conversation, "that I built my whole sense of what counted as real work around the version of success that was easiest to see from the outside. A law degree. A big office. A visible title. I think I looked at your life, the staying-at-home part of it, and assumed that was the whole story, because it was the only part one could actually see without asking real questions. I never once thought to ask what you were actually doing behind that visible surface. I told her I thought that was an honest and important thing to notice about herself. I want to explain what happened in the months that followed, because I think it shows something meaningful about how families can genuinely repair old, mistaken understandings, once someone finally takes the effort to look closely and honestly at the truth. Marisette began asking me real questions about the company at family gatherings, rather than making the small, careless comments she used to make. She started, in a small but meaningful way, actually consulting me before certain family decisions related to the business, treating me, for the first time in years, as the genuine expert I actually was, rather than the sweet, slightly mysterious sister who did a little paperwork from home. At a family dinner about 6 months after that first difficult conversation, Marisette stood up, a little nervous, and said she wanted to say something to the whole family. She talked about her own career, and then, turning to me, she said, clearly and without any of her old careless tone, that she had spent years underestimating what I actually did with my life, mistaking quiet, invisible work for no work at all. My sister has been running a company from a desk in her spare bedroom for 15 years, she said, while also raising 3 incredible kids, and she never once asked anyone to notice. I should have asked. I'm sorry it took me this long to actually see it. I remember feeling something warm settle in my chest at that moment, something that felt, finally, like being truly understood by someone I had loved my whole life. I still work from that same small home office today, though my children are older now, needing less constant hands-on care than they once did. Cordelia is in college, studying business herself, and she has told me more than once that watching me build a meaningful career quietly, on my own terms, taught her something important about what real success can actually look like, beyond the loud, visible markers the world often teaches young women to chase. Perpetua, my youngest, is still in middle school, and she has started, this past year, sitting with me sometimes on weekend mornings while I review reports, asking questions about what different numbers mean. Genuinely curious about the work in a way that reminds me a little of myself at that age, watching my own father go over paperwork at our kitchen table. I do not know yet whether she will grow up wanting a career like mine, or something entirely different. But I hope, whatever she chooses, that she grows up understanding, more clearly than I did at her age, that a woman's real value in her work is never measured by how visible or loud that work happens to be. Marisette and I talk much more often now than we used to, not just at holidays and family dinners, but regularly, checking in with each other the way close sisters should. She called me a few months ago, actually, asking my advice about a financial matter in her own household, something about restructuring some investments for her own children's future education. I remember feeling a quiet, genuine warmth hearing her ask, not because I needed to be asked to feel valuable, but because it showed me, clearly, that something real had shifted between us. She no longer saw me as the sister who simply stayed home. She saw me, finally, as someone whose judgment and knowledge were worth turning to. Just last week, she called again, this time not about finances at all, but simply to talk, the way we used to when we were girls, before careers and marriages and busy adult lives pulled us into our separate, different shapes. We talked for almost an hour about nothing especially important, about our children, about our mother, about an old memory from our childhood neither of us had thought about in years. When we hung up, I sat for a moment in my quiet office, the same small room where I had spent 15 years building something real that almost nobody had noticed, and I felt something settle gently in my chest. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter and steadier than that. Simply the feeling of finally being known, fully, by someone I had loved my whole life. I think often about that dinner where Marisette first said I had never really worked. I do not believe she meant real cruelty by it. I think she simply believed, honestly and without much examination, a story about my life that had been sitting there, unquestioned, for 15 years, because I had never once insisted on correcting it. I have learned something important from all of this. Something I try to remember even now. Quiet work is still real work. Invisible sacrifice is still real sacrifice. And sometimes, the people who love us most simply need to be shown, clearly and honestly, exactly what has been happening all along, hidden in plain sight, behind a closed office door in a spare bedroom, while a baby napped quietly down the hall. I think, too, about all the other women I have met over the years, at school pickup lines, at church, at the grocery store, who carry some version of this same quiet story. Women who manage household finances so carefully that a family never realizes how close to trouble they once were. Women who run small businesses from kitchen tables or care for aging parents while also raising children, or hold together entire extended families through nothing louder than steady, patient effort. I think about how easily the world overlooks this kind of work, simply because it does not come with a title or an office building or a salary announced at a dinner party. I think about how many of these women, like me, have simply learned to accept being overlooked, telling themselves, the way I once did, that the work should not need an audience to matter. I do not believe that anymore, not fully. I still do not need loud recognition to feel proud of what I have built. But I have come to believe that a family owes each other honesty, at the very least, even when that honesty is uncomfortable to speak out loud. I waited 15 years to correct my sister's mistaken belief about my life, and I regret, a little, how long I let that silence sit there, unchallenged. I do not think I will make that same mistake again, in any part of my life, going forward. If someone in your own family looked at your quiet, steady life and decided, without ever really asking, that it meant you had never truly worked, what would you do? Would you let the comments slide, the way I did for so many years? Or would you finally do what I did, and open the door to that quiet room, letting the truth of your own life finally speak for itself?